Welcome to Movement Makers, Salons That Inspire. You might be wondering, what is a salon that inspires? And I think that's a very fair question. Consider this a 30-minute booster shot to help you support, amplify, or build your movement. And we're going to add a little bit of a current event. And so I'm so excited for this first ever salon and the people that you will meet today. But first, I want to tell you, you got to make it all the way through the end. We actually have questions from you, the Movement Maker Collective, and we're so excited about answering those today. So let me introduce you to today's guests. First, we have Victoria Francesco Soto, who is an Associate Dean of Civic Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And Ben Sheehan is a founder of a nonprofit called OMGWTF. I just love saying that. And he is the author of a book called OMGWTF. What does the Constitution say? Yes, there's actually a book about that. So we're going to talk about the centennial anniversary of women's suffrage. And my guests today are incredible fire starters who are also experts on this movement. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Terry.
So I want to start with some foundational facts. So Ben, I'm going to turn to you for this. You have to first tell us about your nonprofit. What does it mean? Why did you start it?
I started it because in 2018, there was a lot of confusion about who serves in our government and what they do. And there was a lot of attention being paid to congressional races, so House and Senate. But I noticed at the time that about 70% of the governors, state secretaries of state, and state attorneys general in the country were up, and they were getting very little attention. So I thought I would start this nonprofit, and the original, the original acronym was OMGWTF for Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, Texas, and Florida. But now it is just a general sentiment of how we feel all the time. So we pivoted away from focusing on races, but we're more about civic education, because it dawned on me when I was talking to a lot of young people. We did events in Texas and Florida and Georgia. A lot of people didn't know that they had a state secretary of state. A lot of people didn't know that they had a state attorney general, let alone what the job does. So I thought that, why is this? And it turns out we've been cutting civics education for decades, to the point where only 8 states are required to teach a year of civics or government K through 12. So a lot of those people who've graduated these last 20 years are now adults, and they're of voting age, and they don't really understand how government works, and they're embarrassed about it. So how can we kind of go back to square one together, start at the top, do a collective generational civics class, and understand how the government works so that we're able to change it?
That's incredible. And before I get into some questions about your book and why you decided to write it, I would love to hear, your reaction. Victoria, you teach, higher education, and this is part of what you do. How does what Ben just laid out, for us, how does that hit?
So the whole time I'm listening to Ben describe his book and the mission of, filling in the civic education that has been taken out of our schools over the last half century, all I wanted to say was amen. Because that is the case, that in the United States, you might get a little bit in elementary school, but for the most part, social studies glosses over anything related to the nuts and bolts of how our system works. And then beyond that is the civic understanding that you need to be engaged. Because how can we expect folks to be engaged if they really don't understand the rules of the game to begin with? And then by engaging, you want to learn more. So it's this virtuous cycle of civic understanding and civic engagement. And for a long time now, we've had that piece of civic understanding really being anemic. So I mean, as Assistant Dean of Civic Engagement, this is my mission in helping bridge that divide by providing kind of these educational opportunities, but also the engagement opportunities for adults who might be a little bit too embarrassed to say that they don't know everything there is to know about the Constitution. And so Ben, just so you know, you're gonna come out to the LBJ school soon and join us to help me with this.
Love that, thank you.
Yes, I think it'd be perfect. And, everyone definitely in Austin would welcome you, and we'll be sure to get you some good barbecue, of course. So tell us a little bit about the book. What is in it? Why is it timely? And if there was one big takeaway that you'd want everyone to remember, what would it be?
Well, just for clarification, here's the book. A lot of people think this is George Washington on the cover, but it's actually James Madison, who had the largest hand of any single individual in writing the document. And he's somebody who probably ends up at, 5, 6, or 7 on the list of founders of the country, but he actually had a lot to do with us.
That's pretty cool.
What's in the book? Okay. So it basically, I thought of this as if I didn't know anything about the Constitution, how would I want to learn about it? So I wrote this as if I was sitting with a friend of mine at drinks and we had 4 hours in an open bar tab. How would I explain this? And so I walked the reader through from beginning to end the entire document. And every article, every amendment, and basically translate in layperson's terms. And the original text of the Constitution is next to what my paraphrase or my translation. So if there's any issues, questions, people can just look at the original text, but I paraphrase it in an understandable way, but then I also make it relevant to today. So we're talking about poll taxes, like what's the history of poll taxes? What does it look like today? What happened in Florida? Is that actually a poll tax? Why do we vote on a Tuesday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November? What do you mean the electors vote on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December? All these weird calendar things that date back to the Constitution and laws made under it. So it's basically somebody on a peer walking you through the Constitution from beginning to end, including jokes and making it relatable and relevant for an audience to understand in 2020.
Well, I definitely always count on you for good jokes. So I can't wait to dig in. So what do you think people know about the 19th Amendment? Do they actually know what it means and what it stands for?
Well, I think you're getting to a very interesting facet of the founding document, is that people think that women got the right to vote on August 18th with the 19th Amendment. But in reality, it's this very Byzantine system where a lot of the voting rights, in fact, all of the voting rights amendments, they don't give people proactively the right to vote, but it protects their right to vote from being taken away. So thanks to the 19th Amendment, as a U.S. citizen, you on the basis of your sex cannot have your right to vote taken away because of your sex. But it doesn't proactively say that now women can get the right to vote, because in reality, women did have the right to vote. There was an article that came out recently talking about how in New Jersey, around at the time just after the Constitution was ratified, women were voting in New Jersey. In fact, Wyoming, 30 years before the 19th Amendment, passed a law saying that women had proactively the right to vote, and about 14 states allowed women to vote before the 19th Amendment. So we think of the 19th Amendment and the 15th Amendment for people on the basis of their skin color and race, but it's not actually granting them voting rights. It's protecting them from being taken away if they're a U.S. citizen. So it's a very strange thing with our country, specifically, unlike with South Africa, where now it says you specifically get the right proactively to vote. It's these sort of after the thought amendments saying, well, you can't have it taken away.
Well, I love that you talk about the times and the geographical locations of where things were moving, because that shows that this really is a movement, right? And we're all about talking about movements today. We want to give people the inspiration to build a movement, start a movement, and support a movement. And so, Victoria, my next question is for you. I recently read an article about how the women of Delta Sigma Theta played a role, even though they really didn't have the same rights as all women. And so they really played that role of amplifying the movement. Can you talk a little bit about how Black women came to the folds of this particular movement?
It's so intricately related, Terri. So, in talking about the building of movements, you can't understand the movement of the suffragette movement without understanding the abolitionist movement, right? So really, we started seeing a movement about rights in the United States of saying, you know what? Doesn't the Constitution say that all men, well, it didn't include the women, but in theory, everyone is created equal. Well, why are we enslaving African Americans? Why are women not voting? So it was with the abolitionist movement that we saw the women's movement, the first women's movement in the middle part of the 1800s gain steam. And so throughout history, we saw Black women, Black males as well, being very close partners with the suffragettes. During the Civil War, there was a little bit of a pause. We came back and we saw the 14th and the 15th Amendment. And then after that was passed, we saw a restarting of a focus on women. And again, we saw the coalitional base come back together, bringing us to, when it was first introduced into Congress in 1878 or right around then. Again, with the movement, it takes a while. So the first time we saw, the 19th Amendment submitted to Congress was 40, 50 years before it actually became an amendment. But a movement does not happen overnight. A movement grows. It started with the abolitionists came through with the coalition of women abolitionists. We saw it being fought out in the streets, American women protesting this. And this is where we arrive at the 19th Amendment in 1920.
I love that so much. I got asked a question this morning when I was recording a podcast, and someone asked me, why did I love politics? And there's so many answers, there's so many reasons, but I'm like, politics is actually the first version of reality TV. There was so much that happened, and you said something that sparked a memory of mine, and no movement moves alone. And Frederick Douglass became really close with a lot of the women who were a part of the women's movement, the suffragettes, and so close that he ended up marrying one of them. And he saw the two movements as they had to move hand in hand because one would not happen without the other. And I really do think sometimes we forget that. And so it's no coincidence that today, we see two movements happening at the same time during this pandemic. So I love that you highlighted that. And so another question that we got from Dari, who sent it to us over Instagram, she asks, have voting rights for women diminished since this amendment passed? And so what would your response be to her, Victoria?
So the good news is that we have made up for lost time as women. So, we didn't get to vote holistically, even though you had some women in the Western states voting, but as a nation until 1920, but we've been outvoting men for the last 40 years. So our turnout rates for Black, Latina, Asian American, Indigenous women, they're all higher. So I think that's the good news. We've been exercising our voting rights robustly. Where I do have concern is with women of color and in areas where voting rights are not as protected or shielded as they should be. Texas being one of the states where we see some laws being proactively put into place, say the voter ID laws, and at the same time, we see the curtailment of some polling places. So I guess how I would answer this is we don't see a direct erasure of women's voting rights or voting rights in general. It's more indirect and insidious, and that's really what worries me for all men and women. And I think that as we come up onto the election, that is what we need to be hypersensitive to and make sure that we are amplifying the voices of folks that are in the voter protection organizations so that they can help make sure that the votes are counted.
And so what can we do? I ask this to either of you. What can we do to protect that right? You would expect for it in 100 years later in 2020 for it not to be at risk and it not to be something that's at jeopardy. But what movement is needed now to protect that most fundamental right we have as an American?
Well, there's an amendment that was recently proposed in a Congress that is a proactive voting rights amendment to proactively grant people the right to vote and not leave it up to the states as it was originally designed. And I think the most important thing, and on top of that, I would say not only a voting rights amendment proactively granting people the right to vote, but also an amendment protecting that in the sense of an anti-gerrymandering amendment so that once people's ballots have been cast, the districts aren't drawn in a way where the certain districts are effectively disenfranchising them through uncompetitive elections, either cramming voters of a certain political party into one district, I think we need at least one voting rights amendment. I would hope for two to really protect, proactively grant, and then prevent that vote from being suppressed through gerrymandering.
Yeah, Victoria, do you have anything to add?
So there's a big picture recommendation and then kind of a smaller one. The big picture one is do away with the electoral college, because being here in super red Texas, or maybe light red Texas these days, my vote's not going to count, just like the vote of my good buddy Linda Lopez in California is not going to count because she's in a deep blue state, and that's very frustrating. And for folks that you're trying to mobilize to get out to vote, knowing that their vote potentially won't count is not going to help the cause. So in terms of something that you can do on a more local basis is engage with organizations that are working to help make the voting process easier. For example, I've recently become involved with an organization called Power the Polls. League of Women Voters does tremendous work. So it's finding those organizations in your communities that are helping ensure the stability and the accountability of our voting procedures.
That's incredible. So Victoria, you and I have something in common, and that's the LBJ Women's Campaign School. I'd love for you, if there's a woman watching who wants to be part of a movement, I'd love for you to tell them a little bit about the campaign school.
Right. So this is our inaugural year. We just launched the LBJ Women's Campaign School, and it's a nonpartisan space for women who are interested in leadership, who are interested in movement, in changing their communities and amplifying the voices of those around them. So what we did is we initially were going to do a traditional class where folks would come in person. We've pivoted to an online platform, but we give them all the tools they need to either run for office or manage a campaign. So we bring women from across the region, across the country together to develop these skills, but at the same time learn from each other. Because sometimes you get the most knowledge from the peer right next to you, from the coffee break, and you're talking about your experiences. So this is this very special space that we have. I'm very proud that it's nonpartisan, because in our hyper-partisan world, how many opportunities do we have to engage one another from different sides of the aisle? So for those of you watching, if you've even had an inkling of curiosity, please, please, please check out the website, email me, contact our executive director, Amy Kroll. We would love to have you be part of this movement.
Yes, I love it. It's been such a joy for me, even simply being an advisor, just being around the energy and the women that are so hopeful and they know that change will come. So it's definitely something that I've grown fond of. Ben, I'm obsessed with all the OMG WTF products. I usually get them at the Outreach when I'm in DC, but tell us where else we can get everything that you have, your books, your jewelry, everything.
So you can buy the books anywhere. They're available at all major retailers. And then as for the jewelry, our site is gerrymanderjewelry.com.
I love it.
Jewelry, necklaces, and pins in the shape of some of the worst gerrymandered congressional districts in the United States, including Texas 35. So if you want to wear a district around your neck that goes from Austin to San Antonio, gerrymandered jewelry is your answer. So we have those available, and yeah, the books, and it's available in hardcover. And I should also add, there's a Spanish version because I thought it was really important that everyone who lives here have access to this information. So there's also a Spanish version of the book.
It's exactly why you two are some of my favorite people. And why I wanted you to be the first to do this with me. Thank you both for being here. And if you want to learn more about how you can build, start, or support a movement, of course, you can pick up Find Your Fire. And in it, there's stories from change makers who are actually working hard to protect our amendments, help get women elected, and start movements in their community. So I hope that you will continue to tune in for the Movement Maker series around Salons That Inspire. And in the meantime, you can find us at MovementMakerCollective.com. See y'all later.